Welcome to How to Be a Dungeon Master. I have a special guest who is back by popular demand. The people wanted more Connie Chang, and Connie has graciously agreed to be back with us for another segment. For those of you who may not be familiar with Connie, I don't know how that's possible now. Connie is the Dungeon Master for the wonderful, incredible, all-transgender D&D stream Transplanar RPG. And as I have recently discovered, just an absolute wealth of information on many topics related to dungeon mastering. So we had to have you back. I'm sorry. It's kind of on you.
It's all good. This is what I signed up for. I knew it coming in. Let's go.
All right. So today we are going to talk about incorporating player backstories into your campaigns. It is a conversation we've had before on this segment. And it's an important one. And there's lots to dissect here, and a lot of dungeon masters do it differently. So I think there's always it's always a good conversation to have. I know I've talked about this before. My first experience with D&D, there was no incorporation of backstories. Even though I kept trying to I didn't even know it was a thing, but I just kept trying to throw my characters' stuff into the story, and it would just get pushed aside. Our group didn't really have any formal relationships that the dungeon master established. We kind of came up with a few on our own just because it felt natural to do that. And then the second time I played D&D, it was a completely, or with a different D&D group, it was a completely different experience where I was asked to create a backstory. And as was everyone else, we were asked to come up with one way that we knew at least one person in the group. And then all of this came up into the story, and it was a completely different experience for me. I, as a player, became way more invested in the campaign, in the group. I loved having these personal relationships with NPCs or with towns or with the other players in my group. So I love player backstories. I love when dungeon masters do creative things with them. I think maybe a new dungeon master might be hearing this and think, that sounds like a lot of work. And I already am doing a lot of work as a dungeon master, and now you want me to sift through pages and pages and pages of backstories and figure out ways to drop these nuggets into my campaigns. And to that, I have a feeling you would say, yes. Yes, I do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Shelly. You're a psychic, because that is my response. Yes. But I do think there is a way to prep your session and session notes, as well as to prep your campaign that doesn't make you burn out as a GM trying to juggle all these balls in the air, right? And I think a lot of it comes during session 0 and during consistent check-ins with your players to make sure you're all on the same page. I just sort of go off, but if you had a specific question, I would also love to answer it. Okay.
No, let's do it. Let's just have you go off.
Great. Awesome. What you said earlier about the one of the first D&D campaigns you were part of, your backstory just wasn't a part of the equation at all. I really feel for you, because I see myself as a newbie DM when I first started DMing, being that DM who didn't really care about my players' backstories, right? I was I've got this story, y'all are going to sign on to it. There's going to be a plot hook, and whether or not your backstory comes up is going to depend on the trajectory of the campaign. And I think that was a mistake. Especially considering the players that I had at that table, who were all very role play focused, and very acting focused as well. Another mistake, this is talking about tone at the table, is they were all interested in a comedy campaign, but I tried to force a horror campaign down their throats. So that didn't really work out. I've learned a lot, basically. I've come a long way.
Lots of lessons.
Yes, in my DMing journey. And I would say during session 0, before you even start really seriously planning for your campaign, I like to do something. I like to ask a unique question to each of my different tables, depending on the pitch of the campaign, right? That relates to their backstory. So to bring up an example from Transplanar RPG, which is the all-trans D&D actual play stream that I'm a part of, that Shelly you mentioned earlier, the question that I asked all 4 of my PCs during session 0 is, tell me about something that something earth-shattering that happened to your character 7 years ago. And each of them had like a specific but different event that like shaped their character's life 7 years ago. And the reason why it was 7 years and why it had to be earth-shattering and typically bad, right, was related to stuff I was planning in the main campaign, but that they didn't get to like discover until like session 3 or 4, right? So I would say look at the specific bones of your unique particular campaign, because I know like 80% of y'all homebrew stuff, right? Which is awesome. And think of a specific backstory question that you could ask each of your PCs to give them some common ground, even if you're coming from a perspective of, oh, our PCs are strangers who meet in a tavern session 1, which is fine, right? Or if you want them to have known each other and been traveling together already, and that's where you drop them in session 1, no matter what. Think of a unique question or several, right? Tailored to the premise of your particular campaign, and ask that question during session 0. That would be my first piece of advice.
So you're asking it in front of the player, like none of this will be secret to the other players?
I asked, all of them know that they're answering this question, but they all gave me secret answers.
Oh, okay. They all, okay.
Yes. And whether or not you want to keep the secret is up to you and up to like what your players are interested in. If they like a little bit more mystery, if they want to like keep their backstory secret a little bit, definitely ask for like, oh, just DM me or like answer on Discord or like text it to me, right? But it can be helpful if they all know that they're answering the same question. You can also play around with like giving them different questions, right? Depending on like their class or depending on like the character concept they're fiddling with. But that's a great way, I think, to start not only like already thinking of ways to incorporate your players' backstories into the campaign, but also so you don't have to, you plan for this, right? This is part of your prep. It's not like you taking on extra work, right? Like you know that this is going to be part of your campaign, so you don't, have to worry about burnout so much on that front.
So the question about, you want me to do this? It seems like a lot of work. Okay, that's actually my question. That was me.
Okay, that's fair.
The more I thought about it, the more I started thinking, well, maybe they might be doing some of the work for me, if like depending on how detailed their backstories get, or maybe I'm asking specific questions so that if I ask them about a location, for instance, and they provide me with a lot of details on that location, couldn't I just set some of my story in that location?
Yes, 100%. Use what your players give you, right? Like that just like helps you not have to, over stress about prep for sure.
Right. So I don't have to worry about building this location now because the player has built it, and also they're getting something out of it too because they must have some emotional attachment to this.
100%. There's already that built-in player buy-in because they came up with it, right? So players will sometimes give you, in like TTRPG play terms, like knives, right? Which are emotional things that they hand you that you can stab them with, right? So if a player comes up with a tragic backstory, they're like, this NPC wronged me, burned down my village. Drop the NPC in, like they are literally handing that to you on a silver platter, right? And you can ask guiding questions during session 0 and even beyond session 0, right? Just pop into their DMs and be like, hey, based on da-da-da-da-da, right? If this is a persistent campaign, but you're trying to think of ways to infuse backstory more into what you've already built up. Ask guiding questions, ask for knives, straight up. Like, you can even, like, if you know your paladin, right, has like an acrimonious relationship with their father, right, be like, all right, like player, like I'm going to DM you on the side. Like this next session upcoming, I'm really interested in that. Why don't you tell me about one of your father's mistresses, right? They're like, mistress? What? Like, yeah, tell me about her. You know about her. And they will, I swear to you, they will give you a juicy description that you can use against them next session. Like leading questions, that's really like a big part of this, I think.
So do your players know, and is it the right thing to do to tell them that like anything they say and do can be used in a campaign against them?
I think as long as we're all on the same page about it, it should be good. I know different players also have like different, I think, approaches of protectiveness over their PCs, or like, no, I don't think my father would have had a mistress, or like, no, I don't think my father was mean in this way. I think he was mean in that way, right? So I know that's, I've definitely played at tables with player characters who are like, when I'm like portraying an NPC from their backstory, I would say like 99% of the time they really like what I do, but there's that 1% of the time with that one character, with that one player who's like, I don't think you did that right. You know, like that's my NPC from my backstory, and that's not how I imagine them to act. Right. And I think in like those situations when you're really trying to incorporate backstory into the campaign and your players for some reason don't like it, you know, or they're particularly, I think, possessive over their backstory or their character, that's a good time to like break out an out of character conversation about like what your responsibilities are as a GM versus what their responsibilities are as a player. Right. Because I think my response in that situation would be like, I hear you, and you probably play this character in other campaigns as well. That's the most common situation for this. But this is our campaign, right? I'm the GM here. These are the other players you're with. And I would really appreciate it if you gave me some grace and some flexibility to interpret this NPC in my own particular way, right? That is like that's a response that I think has played out well for me. I forget what your original question was. I'm so sorry, Shelley. Just sort of went off.
I forget too. I think about asking if, like, letting them know that whatever you put in the backstory could potentially come back to them, because like you're bringing up a good example with the person when like your father had mistresses, and like maybe that's like, oh, like that's gutting to the thought of that.
Yeah,
and like you've actually like that could change a very big part of them as a character, and like you know, so I guess just more of like how do you dance around that line? Like you want to be surprising, and you want to have these great story hooks, but you also don't want to really cross the line for the player.
100%. A dance is a really great way of putting it. Obviously having safety tools in play, so like your players can X card anything you do. If they're like, I really don't want to deal with a mistress subplot, like please don't do that. Great, that's fine. They can exit, right? Like I make it clear to my players they can always veto what I do. I just might have to like take some time to pause and take a break and think of like ways to write around or like plan around the veto, right? Something else is just knowing your players and knowing the kinds of stories they're interested in, right? Like for example, my partner who's in Transplaner with me as a player, they're really interested. They're like, here, have all the knives, stab my character with them. I invite you to make me cry. So I know sort of with my partner C, like it's no holds barred, like pretty much anything and everything's fair game. But I also, because I know my player as a person, I also know what their hard lines are, right? So I would never throw anything to do with like alcohol addiction, right, to them, because I know that's just like a straight up line they have, right? But outside of that, and like several other things as well, like anything's fair game. Meanwhile, for one of my other players, right, they're like, they very specifically have a line around like memory loss. So even though there was like an arc in our stream that kind of dealt with memory loss, I made sure that it was never affecting their character and never came up in their backstory as well. So like whenever I'm like planning things that I feel like could be gray area, I always check in like a spoiler free way with my players first. I'm like, hey, I'm planning these things for your backstory to come up in the campaign without spoiling anything for you. Would you be okay with these themes? And I lay out the themes that I'm dealing with. So for example, like parents lying to you, right, about what you thought was truth. Or like one of your parents dying in an unexpected way, right? Would you be okay with that? And they'd be like, what? Yes, but now I'm fearful. Like now I'm scared. What do you mean?
Right.
So I think as long as you're like checking in and you know your players and you're using safety tools, you have an updated document of their lines and veils, then I think you can go for it. Right. I think players also, generally speaking, are really excited when GMs go for it, right? And bring up their backstory in unexpected ways.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, good. Good to know. All right. Do you want to go launch into like your next bullet here?
I don't have anything. Go for it, Shelley.
Okay. So we talked about that. Well, you're kind of answered a ton of my questions here. Okay. Do you encourage the players to work together on any element of their backstory, or is it just very much siloed?
I think this really depends on the premise of your campaign. My experience with Transplaner, they pretty much came up with 1 to 3 at session 0. My players came up with 1 to 3 character concepts and they pitched it to the table at large. You know, one by one, we went down. We were like, I have these 3 characters I'd be interested in playing in this stream campaign. Here they are. Here's a little pitch. Here's a little spiel about their backstory. A little bit like 2 to 3 sentence. Like, idea. And we as a group, like basically voted on like the pitches that we were most interested in from each player, right?
Oh.
Yeah, we had like a kind of like open freeform discussion. And then after our like actual final character concepts were solidified, they went off in their own separate corners and came up with more fleshed out backstories, right? And then they answered that session 0 question I had, which is what happened 7 years ago, right? That was like earth shattering. That was the extent of collaborative character creation for them. Because all 4 of my players said they were interested in meeting for the first time during episode 1. So they didn't want to know each other, right?
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so that's why they went off into their own corners and like worked on it alone. If my players had expressed a desire for them to all be part of the same mercenary group or like all part of the same like civilian militia or had like the same connecting thread in their backstory, then that would be an absolutely different scenario. Like then I would make character creation a lot more out in the open and a lot more collaborative. So I think it depends on the premise. And one of the first questions I do think you should answer as a group, especially if you're playing D&D during session 0, is do you want to have known each other before session 1? Because that will really shape how you do character creation.
So that kind of touches on something too I wanted to talk about. Do you have a list of like must-haves for a backstory? Like what things should you just say, players, I need this list from you, if nothing else?
That is a great question. My answer actually to that is no. I know some GMs have every campaign give me 2 NPCs, like one of them that helps you, one of them that hurts you, right? Like, and give me like one thing a secret, and like a rumor. Yeah. And I know like some GMs have that list, right? But I actually don't. Because the way I like to prep my campaigns is very premise and player dependent, right? So for an example, I'll give a one-shot that I ran recently on F and Funny's channel for Abria Iyengar, Gabe James Games, Critical Bard, and Christina Ariel. It was like a level 20 one-shot.
There,
I know, right? It was amazing. I'm like literally still reeling from it on. I'm gonna name drop them wherever I go, every podcast I'm on. The premise that I'd pitched was the 4 of you are reincarnated demigods fighting the same eldritch beast that killed you and destroyed your home plane. Like, that was it. So, like, in terms of, like, backstory, all I asked for them was, what were your domains, right? What were you the demigod of? Give me up to 2. And just as long as there's no crossover, we're fine. As well as there were 4 players, so I popped 4 questions into the chat, first come, first serve, and had them collaboratively build the world based on their backstories, right? So the first question I had was something like, what is the full name of your home plane? The second one was like, what is something beautiful about your home plane? The third one was, what is something terrifying about your home plane? The fourth one was like, what is something unique about your home plane? And like first come, first serve, they each just grabbed the ones they were interested in or what was left over, and they built the world from those prompts, like from those seeds. They just completely branched it out and discovered backstory through play. But that's a unique situation because it was streamed and it was a one shot. So if it's like a home game that's a persistent campaign, I would say you really can't go wrong with asking for names. Ask them for NPCs that have wronged them or that have loved them in some way. You want to use like really active, strong verbs when thinking about how PCs could relate to the NPCs could relate to the player characters. 2 to 3 NPCs is a great place to start. Anything more than that, and I start to lose track, especially because you have 4 players and like 2 to 3 NPCs per player. That's like 12 NPCs already. That's enough. That's like enough for like an arc, right, of your campaign. Like you don't need to do any other work. Just use those NPCs that they gave you in your backstory, right? I also always like to come up with like a secret, right? That like each PC has, like what is something that you don't want to get out? Like what is something that you've either done or that like a secret about you that would destroy your life if it came out. Like and obviously send it to me secretly, right? As well as like another interesting question could be like, what is a rumor, right? That other people might have heard about your PC, right? What is that's something about your PC? Yeah, that's always a lot of fun. Like what's something about your PC's reputation that precedes them, right? And that could like help, especially if you're trying to do like our PCs are strangers to each other situation. They could have heard of each other, if not like actually interacted with each other. And this isn't so much backstory, but is more about like guiding RP and play. I always like to ask for 3 flaws as well. as well as like what is your PC's greatest dream or like goal or hope, right? And like 3 fears that they might have as well, just to sort of like help me design encounters and whatnot.
I like it. And that actually touches on something else that I was thinking about. It's one of the things I loved about 5th edition was the addition of the flaws and the backgrounds and like all of these great little elements that if you are having trouble coming up with a little bit of history about your character, you can just create it on the spot.
Totally.
So typically when I think about a backstory, I think about like paragraphs and paragraphs of like details about my character. But the character sheet can also provide a lot of that information for the dungeon master, just based on like the flaws, the backgrounds, the maybe the equipment that they choose to carry. Like this is like a very special dagger that was handed down to them from somebody, or the skills that they're trained in. If they're like really are very, very good at deception. Why is that? So do you use any elements of the character sheet to inform some other elements of backstory?
That's really interesting question, Shelley, because I find that those character quirks tend to be discovered during play. Sometimes I'll run into GMing a player character who's like, I've optimized my character sheet and I feel like my character has like a plus 12 to deception because maybe they worked at a thieves guild, right? And they like hand me that or something. And I'm like, great, I can run with it. But a lot of times people discover this sort of thing through play. You know, they're looking at their sheet, they're looking at their barbarian who has like a proficiency in survival. They're like, maybe my barbarian lived in the wilderness, right? For like 5 years before the start of this campaign. And like, I'm informed, my role play is informed by that. They're really gruff and rough around the edges, you know, they're illiterate or whatever. So I tend to maybe play for a couple of sessions before picking up on what my players are putting down and then putting that into the campaign. Because a lot of times I've played with, you know, players who don't write anything for their backstory, right? And they just sort of discover where their character is from by playing. And I don't think there is a right or wrong way to go about that. As long as like all of you are on the same page about like the extent of backstory you're creating for each character.
Yeah, I've definitely discovered things about characters through play that I wouldn't have thought about while just crafting the actual backstory. So
100%.
I like being open to that as well.
Definitely. And honestly, a piece of advice I would have is embrace that. I would say don't plan your backstory too much. Write just enough so you know where you're going for the next session or two, but not after that, right? Just like so much of the fun of D&D while you're playing this instead of writing a novel, right? Or like playing a video game with like predetermined story paths is because there's other players at the table and there's a GM who's guiding the story together. You're collaboratively building the world and the campaign. Be open, right? To like possibilities you could have never considered just sitting by yourself in your room writing your backstory. And I really do want to put that forward, like as like one of like my main pieces of advice here. Don't over prep for the GM, and also for players, don't over prep for your characters as well, because then you sort of close yourself off to possibilities, right? If you have a very strong, specific vision for what you want your character to be, and where you want them to have come from.
Yeah, I had played in a wonderful one-off game that it was for Mother's Day, and all of the actual players in the group were mothers.
Aww.
And it was delightful. And I was, because it was a one-off, I had just, you know, kind of picked a character from my arsenal of characters and thought a little bit about how she might fit into this story. But I realized as we were playing, she developed completely differently than I initially thought that she would be. And I just loved her. Like, it was only like a 2-hour game, but I'm like, just from what was happening in the story, I just was open to like just seeing how it felt natural for her to respond, instead of feeling like, well, I know that this character is a tabaxi and a ranger, but she didn't act like. Usually when I play a tabaxi, I'm much more cat-like, standoffish, aloof, kind, you know. And she just became very maternal. So anyway, I agree with that that sentiment. Wonderful things can happen when players are just open to discovering those things about each other and about their own players as well.
Totally.
Yeah. So what if you have a player that is new and or just like not like prolific or like doesn't want to. I don't know what my backstory is. I don't know. You figure it out or something. Like, do you have any guidelines for, like, they may be wonderful role players and very imaginative. It's just like the idea of crafting a backstory might be a little daunting to them.
I'd see those players as a challenge, right?
Oh.
Like as a fun challenge. I had a player like that who's actually outside of D&D, like a professional actor. So it was so interesting that they didn't really care about fleshing out their backstory. Because I was like, you're an actor. I thought that would be something you'd be really, okay, great, that's fine. And I just sort of took it upon myself because they were like, I'm fine with anything you come up with, right? These tend to be the players who are like, you tell me, like, I don't really care, or like, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know what I am allowed and am not allowed to create, / they honestly sometimes just have no idea, or they really just want you to come up with stuff for them. I will just come up with stuff for them. I'll be like, hey, Jolt, right? You're in this dungeon and you see your brother whom you thought, you had lost, like in like a chaotic battle many years ago, and he's here and he's chained up and he's a captive, like, and he's staring at you and he's gagged. What do you do? Right? And that just injecting, like just throwing crazy stuff at them and like seeing how they respond, like, is so much fun. And those kinds of players, I've noticed, tend to, even like if after session 0, they're the one with like the least amount of backstory, especially if they're playing with other players who have backstory and who are bringing like a really incredible depth to how they portray their PCs through roleplay. They tend to sometimes feel a little left out. Like they're like, oh, dang, like I wish I did come up with more backstory, and like make it clear to them that it's never too late. Like you can always tell me stuff about your character that you're now figuring out through play, right? But just feeling like you have the freedom as a GM to just throw stuff at those kinds of players, I think is a great way to take it, as well as maybe pulling them aside out of play, sending them a DM or a text or something, being like, hey, I'm noticing that like your character, like we don't know too much about where they're from. Do you mind answering these questions from me? And like asking them questions of your own to maybe help guide their process.
Oh, yeah. Leading questions so that they know. Because maybe it's just a little daunting, like you said, like, I don't know where to begin. I don't know what's allowed. I don't know what I can and can't do here. So maybe reining that in a little bit for them.
Yes, that's also reminding me of, I don't know if you've been watching Xandria Unlimited with Abria Yengar DMing.
Yes.
But there's this really funny clip, I think from their first episode, where Amy Carrero playing this, I forget if she's, I forget her race and class, but I think Amy Carrero is a new player. And there's a moment where she was like asking Abria, like, would my character have heard of an ocean before? Like, does she know what a large body of water is? And Abria was like, what? I don't know. It's your character. Have you heard of the ocean before? And that was just a moment that made me laugh so much, because I feel like a lot of new players are like, they feel like they need to ask permission, right? For like what their characters can and can't do, what they don't do and don't know. And I'm just straight up I'm talking directly at you if you're a new player. You could just decide things about your character, and your GM will let you know if that's information they actually wouldn't have access to. Yes, your character has probably seen an ocean before. They probably know what a desert is. They know what a tree is, right? Unless you have a very specific backstory of them like growing up in the Underdark, right? Never have heard of or have seen these things, right? So you can just sort of decide things, right? As long as your DM doesn't say you can't do this, right? Or for whatever reason, like, it's fair game. Like, you can come up with stuff. Please feel empowered to come up with a backstory for your character, right? I promise you your GM will be like, great, that's fine, right? As long as it doesn't contradict any like canon campaign things they're prepping.
And that's kind of a great start to a backstory. If your character has not heard of an ocean and has never seen an ocean,
I know.
I would like to know why.
Because that's
why have
so
you
many
not?
Possibilities.
Yes.
Are they from
your
the
parents
Feywild, or like
were you deliberately kept away from oceans?
Yes.
Because of some terrible curse? I don't know. Like, why have you not seen the ocean? I must
now I want to play a character that is deliberately kept away from the ocean because of a curse.
Yes. what is going to happen.
I know, right?
Okay. Okay. One more question. Do you ever like pit characters against each other? Like after seeing something in their backstory, I'm like, oh, this one is very much pro whatever, and this one kind of has maybe not the same feelings. Is that like really bad to do as a dungeon master? Or do you ever just find like, oh, this could be a fun little just diversion in the campaign?
Sometimes I look at my PC's backstories and I go, oh ho ho, interesting. There's some connections I could draw here. And it's, Shelly, I swear to you, it's less me pitting them against each other and more so them pitting themselves against each other. Because if you come up with a backstory, your players come up with a backstory where one of them is really loyal, right, to a queen or to a faction or a cause, and then one of them just independently so happened to have betrayed, right, or deserted, or like was treasonous against that like cause or faction or queen or ruler or whatever, the drama will ensue naturally. Your job as the GM isn't to be like you hate each other and like establish a pre-existing acrimonious relationship, but more so to just present scenarios, give them opportunities, right? Put them in a tavern and have like the person who's really loyal to the crown, have their commanding officer also be in the tavern and be like, oh, there you are. It's been ages. Hey, haven't seen you since the conquest of blah, blah, blah. And the other character survived the conquest of blah, 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 right? And now they see their party member in completely new eyes, right? Completely new light. So I see my job, right, as a GM, less so as like the storyteller, the puppet master, and more so as a facilitator of fun experiences. I set the scene, right? I put up the props on stage. I put Chekhov's gun on the counter, right? It's up to my players if they want to pick up that gun or if they want to like pursue the fun little items I've scattered about, like the trail for them. But yeah, if that sort of thing, that's like a present, that's a gift. It's what I call a gift, right? If that juicy, like dramatic pearl is there in multiple players' backstories, I will absolutely find ways to like make that relevant in the campaign itself.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
It's wonderful when they naturally happen.
Oh, yes, so wonderful. There's also ways you can ask questions that you will, so you can create those moments for yourself.
Yes. It reminds me of the daycare that my son basically grew up in, but they're wonderful. And they would have like stations set up around the classroom. Like they call them like provocation station. I don't know. They had like a fancy little name for them. But it would just be like a bunch of pipe cleaners and some glue or like Jenga blocks or some just like random stuff around the room. And you could just wander up to the pipe cleaner station and like come up with like a really cool, intricate, beautiful design. And like the way that you're describing, like, I'm just setting this, I'm just going to leave these little
100%.
stations all around the camp. And if they wander up to the pipe cleaners and sniff around and don't do anything, okay, they're there if you want. But if they want to explore those pipe cleaners and create something wonderful and juicy, that's great too.
100%. It's a term in like improv known as like giving gifts, right?
Yeah.
You give gifts to your players, right? Set up the situations, lay out the pipe cleaners, give them the glue, right? Give them these shiny toys to play with, and I guarantee you they will play with them, right? Like 9 times out of 10 they will, right? It's a rare player that walks away, and they probably only walk away because they're too scared of how much fun they'll have. They'll be like, oh no, I feel like my character isn't emotionally ready to have that confrontation yet, right?
Yeah. But you know it's there. It's there when you're ready.
Yep.
So the more that we're talking, the more I realize this is actually helping you as a dungeon master. It's not additional work. We're helping to inform the story and giving you lots of juicy little nuggets to play with.
Yes. When your players give you backstory, they're basically telling you, this is what I'm interested in. Like, can you please make this relevant somehow? Right? Even if they don't straight up say it, that's basically what that is, right? Like when players come up with backstory, like how sad and, shot down in a way. Like it must feel if they give you all this and it never comes up, right?
Right.
So honestly, I've been in campaigns, you never know when a campaign will end. Like, you straight up don't. Like, sometimes, lives just collide in such a way that you play 4 sessions of what you thought was going to be like a persistent campaign, and then people just split up. So as a GM, my advice to you, drop stuff in early. Like, don't hold on to stuff, just do it. Just drop it in, because you never know when your next session is going to end, quite frankly. And also, that hooks your players immediately right off the bat. Can you imagine if you dropped like one player's backstory into session 1 somehow, right? That would be awesome. And then other players are going to be like, oh, when's it going to be my turn, right? And that keeps them invested and interested as well. Don't jealously guard, right, the juicy bits that you've got planned for your players. Even if you don't drop it all in, right, just drop little hints in somehow. Give them a rumor of like how their estranged sister is doing, right? Like, allow them to walk through a town that's devastated by the same magical storm that destroyed their village. Something like that. Little tidbits that you can absolutely plop into every session that you run. And I make it a challenge for myself to make my players' backstories relevant in every episode of Transplanar RPG. Like in Arc 3, we've done 8 episodes so far. I don't think there has been a single episode that's gone by where my players' backstories haven't been relevant in a major way to the plot or what they're doing. Same for like much of Arc 2 as well. And that is just so important to me as a GM.
That's amazing. That's quite the record.
Oh, thank you.
Well, your players must just love playing with you.
Aw, well, yeah, I like to think they do. Some really good feedback I've gotten for running for Magpie Games curated play program. Magpie Games is like a TTRPG publisher and distributor. Is that my players really appreciate that even the one-shots are so character specific, because I always like take a break to write down ideas for how their backstory is relevant to like the actual campaign and the actual story. Because that is where I think a lot of player buy-in can be found, right? If you find your players losing engagement, it's probably because like this is one way to like draw them back in, right? Like, is to just make their backstories relevant, make what they've already set up that they're interested in relevant to the campaign.
Makes sense. And it makes for a great game.
It does. It does.
Do you have any other pearls of wisdom you want to drop on our listeners before I let you go?
Oh, boy.
Grudgingly.
Let me think. I would say that there are definitely players who will give you like 4 pages on Google Docs, single space, right? MLA format of their backstory. And then at the exact same table, you'll find a player that is, like we mentioned earlier, I don't care, you do whatever, right? Something I like to do to sort of find a happy medium between those two things when doing character creation is they can send me as much material or as little material as they want, as long as each player at the table can tell me, like, give me a quick rundown of your character and what's important about their backstory. 3 to 4 sentences, that's it. Which will force the player who, gave me 4 pages to like think of the most important bullet points and write them down in 3 to 4 sentences. And it will also force the player who doesn't have anything to generate at least something I can work with, right? And I find that 3 to 4 sentences per backstory question I lob at them, or just in general, is a great medium, right? That's enough prep. That's just enough content for me to work with for sessions 1 and 2, right? And it doesn't make me feel overwhelmed. So just make sure that you have at least a little bit of something from each player to work with before you prep your first session of your campaign, would be my takeaway advice, I think. Because you don't want to have too much, but you also don't want to have too little. 3 to 4 sentences. I think that's like a good place.
Okay. You make it sound easy, but it also sounds really fun and inspiring, and I kind of want to create backstories, but I also want to like create a world based on backstories. This just sounds fun. And I'm, kind of into the why your character has never been to the ocean as the jumping off point.
Someone do like an ocean terror campaign.
Find out.
Love that.
Yes. As usual, you're amazing. And I so appreciate you taking the time to talk about dungeon mastering again. I have a feeling it's not going to be the last time we chat, maybe. But where can people find out more about you and follow along with all the great things you're working on?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me here, Shelley. I've been Connie, pronounced the he, she. You can find me on Twitter and Patreon and itch at by Connie Chang, ByConniechang. I am also the GM and executive producer behind Transplanar RPG on Twitter, Twitch, and most recently Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Podbean and everywhere else you get your podcasts, because we've just very recently, literally yesterday as of the recording of this, converted our live stream into a podcast, starting with Arc 1, Episode 1. So,
oh my God, it's amazing.
I know, it's very exciting. If the way you like to consume actual play content is not through streams because you find that difficult in some way, now you can finally listen to our show as a podcast. So I would really appreciate it if y'all tuned in to our little all-trans POC-led story set in our very own original non-colonial anti-Orientalist world, in a realm where the stars and the gods have vanished and vicious monsters stalk the night. Right? Very poetic and dramatic campaign is how I would describe it.
I love it. Oh, that's so awesome about the podcast. I was telling you about how I spent some hours at the dentist this morning, and I would just listen to podcasts the whole time.
Heck yeah.
I love a good podcast. So I may have to, even though I've watched much of the stream, I may have to just start over in podcast form.
Oh, Shelley. Oh, I'd be so grateful and so honored.
Well, you're amazing, and everybody should definitely check out all the work that you're doing. And thank you again for being my guest on How to Be a Dungeon Master.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.